We must certify service charge accounts when more than 4 dwellings are involved. Something that we are quite commonly asked to do is where there isn't a provision in a lease to, or it isn't specified in a lease that service charge accounts should be certified or must be certified. The owners or the residents of those developments very often see that as an unnecessary expenditure. Well, actually, if there's more than 4 dwellings involved, we've got to do that. It's part of this code. We must issue clear service charge demands that include the landlord's name and address and a summary of tenants' rights and obligations. These are really important things that should be included with any invoice for service charges. If we don't include those, you don't have to pay your service charges. It's as simple as that. On everyone's chair I put a copy of a summary of tenants' rights and obligations for reference, and in short it is a big long list of your rights and reasons why you might not have to pay your service charge if something hasn't been done correctly, and not issuing that means that you can withhold your service charges. Landlord's details we touched on slightly earlier, but similarly every invoice for service charges must include the landlord's name and address. Fail to do that, you don't have to pay your service charge. So there's a lot of things in there which are perhaps just slightly less than, or more than, than the common sense of what you might expect a managing agent to do or not to do. We'll come on slightly to a subject we touched on earlier with residents' rights. There is a whole section in the RICS code about the statutory rights of tenants, many of which are listed on the summaries of tenants' rights and obligations that you have. And these are all things which you as a tenant, or we'll touch on slightly later on, residents' associations have the right to. A lot of it is information. So you have a right to know your landlord's name and address. You have a right to information about your service charges and a right to challenge them. You can request a summary of those costs, and there is a time limit that a managing agent must reply in. Typically, you should get those as a matter of course within 6 months of the financial year end. But also, if that's failed to happen, if you request them after that date, you should get them within 21 days of making that request. You have a legal right to that. You have a right to information about administration charges. These are what they call variable administration charges. So where your lease specifies a set amount for a certain thing, like for argument's sake, you must pay to the freeholder £50 every time you sublet your property. That isn't a variable administration charge, that's a fixed administration charge. But if they're entitled to charge what they think is a reasonable amount for issuing a licence or a permission, or whatever the particular administration charge might be, then you have a right to information on that and to challenge that. You have a right to consultation on qualifying works, which we talked a little bit about before. You have a right to information on your buildings insurance. It's quite common that with the legal framework where the freeholder and there isn't a management company, and then there's each leaseholder, for the freeholder to be able to place buildings insurance, and they might make some commission on doing that, and you have a right to look at that buildings insurance, to have a summary of that, to inspect the policy, and under the Financial Services Act you have a right to ask the freeholder to disclose any commissions that they might be earning on your insurance. You have a right to arrange a management audit. Unfortunately this costs you money though, because it must be done by a surveyor or an accountant if you want to go along that route. You have a right to appointment of a manager at a first tier tribunal, which is another alternative to right to manage. However, as with right to manage, it's not necessarily one to be taken too lightly. Appointment of a manager is a fault-based piece of legislation. So you have to be able to prove at a tribunal that your current manager is not complying with this code, not managing your development in a diligent way, not providing services reasonably and of a right quality. And the manager has a right to put any faults that are incurred right before appointment of a manager can take place. So it can be, again, quite a lengthy process, but it is an alternative to right to manage. Again, we touched on it slightly earlier, but you have a right of first refusal to buy your freehold. I think the only thing we didn't say on that earlier was that when acquiring a freehold in that way, the freeholder cannot sell that freehold to somebody else for less than they've offered it to you. So if they come to you with an amount and you decide that you don't want to buy it, and then they go to somebody else and say, I'll give it to you for a bit less because I like you, actually they need to offer it to you for less first before they go down that route. Enfranchisement and lease extension, we talked a little bit on again, and you also have a right to vary your lease. So with leases which have a fundamental error, very often a first-tier tribunal is the best way to go about that, because they will almost treat it as a paper exercise to say, okay, we've got 10 flats here, and it specifies in every lease that everyone has to pay 1/9 of the service charge. It doesn't add up to 100%. They'll just make that alteration. But if it's something that everyone would like to do rather than it's necessary to do, then you have the right to do that. But a percentage needs to agree. So I think the percentages, Jane will clarify, 75% must agree and no more than 10% must object to varying a lease. And that includes the freeholder as well as the leaseholders. You have a right to form a recognised tenants association, which we will come on to and cover in the next slide, or the next subject. You have the right to manage, and also something which is little used, but you have the right to compulsory acquisitions and security at the end of long-term tenancy, which really relates to when there is extreme if I can speak, negligence on behalf of a landlord. It's quite a heavily fault-based piece of legislation, that. So I've probably talked enough, I think, in terms of whizzing through all those things. Shall we have some questions?
I think it's just worth saying this covers an enormous amount of content, and it's really interesting. The way the document is set out, in the margin of every comment that the managing agent or management company are obliged to is the exact reference in the law that backs it up. So you might feel anxious about saying, well, we demand a management audit, but actually it'll tell you where you've got that right from as well. So it's a really important document. And Chris has been through the details to some extent in it, but there's a lot of stuff. I know you've all got questions. I've got one that I want to ask, which is, it says in part 20, and I know this might refer to people here, qualifying tenants have the right to have a management audit carried out. Landlords and managers must comply with valid notices in this respect. What is a management audit?
A management audit is as a resident or a group of residents, a resident association, you having a professional audit of everything that the manager, the managing agent, has done for you. So typically that would include things like going through every single item of expenditure, every single invoice, looking at the reasonableness of those. Really, it's a thorough inspection of everything that the managing agent is doing. It's carried out typically by a surveyor or an accountant,
Appointed by whom?
by the tenant,
Why don't we hear
Paid for
more?
by the tenant.
Why
and
don't we
paid
hear
for
more
by
about
the
this?
tenant.
Why don't we
I
hear
mean,
more about this?
it's. I think it's a little used right because it costs people money, and I think it's as simple as that.
And there's no guarantee it's going to necessarily lead anywhere. Why would you have a management audit done? Clearly, you're not happy with the way the place is managed. You want to bring pressure to bear to improve things, and this seems to be something that's available.
It is. I mean, I think it's the sort of scenario where you've got potentially a managing agent who is not very transparent in the way they're behaving, and it's a right that you have to get to the bottom of the information that you want to know. And
you might go on from there to make an application to the First Tier Property Tribunal regarding your service charges. So it's a way of getting information, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ryan first.
On that point, if cost is an issue, what are the requirements of the body which is going to perform the audit? As in, can the residents themselves perform a management audit, or does there need to be somebody who's registered with either the charters?
It has to be a professional, so it's a chartered surveyor or a chartered accountant.
There's nothing to
Does it
stop
have to
a
be a chartered?
resident who has that qualification doing
No.
it, though, is
Because
there?
No, absolutely,
I'm
yeah.
a qualified accountant, so
yeah.
I personally, in my own right, although I'm not qualified to practice, I have got a qualification in that. Would I be qualified to take on that audit?
Yeah.
Does it have to be a
I'd have to check that, because I'm not sure exactly what the legislation says about whether or not you have to hold a current, whether you have to be just have a qualification or be registered with an appropriate body. So for a surveyor, whether you have to be an appropriately qualified surveyor, not just a surveyor. Because obviously within RICS there are different surveyors who are qualified for different
I think the chartered part is probably the key, isn't it? That you don't necessarily have to be working in an organisation. You know, if you are a member of, someone like the that's the one. I'm trying to think of the acronym for it. Then I guess there's no reason why not, as far as I understand. Yeah.
Okay, let's Angela,
Yeah,
and then
please,
Howard.
just quickly. To actually buy the freehold, we said previously you needed 50% of the residents to agree to that. If the other, say you had 51%, if 49% don't want to do it, can you force them to?
No, it's just you who are buying.
So you actually, you would then incur the cost.
Yes.
Yeah.
49% you don't want
So let's say there was 10 flats and they wanted £1,000 a flat to buy the freehold, and 6 of you participate, then 6 of you would need to find £10,000 to buy the freehold.
But then you can charge the other 4 whatever you like for ground rent.
Or what's in the lease.
No, you can't. You buy the freehold subject to the existing leases. So there are 2
But
scenarios.
the existing leases mostly say they can charge virtually what they like.
Well, no.
Within reason. But
There are 2 scenarios with buying the freehold. There's the opportunity that arises because your freeholder wants to sell and has to go through the procedure of offering it to the residents, and then if the required number of qualifying tenants say they want to buy, they then normally would nominate a company that they form to be the buyer. And those participating residents are the shareholders in the company, and they put the money in and they buy the freehold on whatever terms the landlord was offering. There is also the reverse scenario where the tenants may all get together and serve a collective enfranchisement notice on the landlord saying, we want to buy the freehold, we want to offer you £100,000, whatever it is. I mean, it varies from block to block, and we've got the right number. And then there again is the statutory procedure that has to be followed. The landlord would serve a counter notice saying, well, I'm happy to sell it to you, but I want twice the amount of money you've offered. Usually in that situation, negotiations go backwards and forwards, and if they can't agree, it ends up in the tribunal to set the price with representation from everybody surveyors. Then, depending on what the outcome of the tribunal is, you're then on a fairly swift statutory timetable to actually complete the purchase.
Okay, that's
Sorry,
helpful.
yeah, no,
Wapping Key have done that. They bought the freehold, but not everybody participated in it. Quebec Key, I think, have done the same, and that was a larger development, but again, not everyone participated, but only those who formed the company. Howard, you've got a...
Just a quick one on that note. If you were to acquire the freehold, what differences does that make in terms of your ability to remove a management company that's in place?
Depends on what the lease says a little bit. If you have a management company, so the lease says, we were talking about this in the break actually, if the lease says that company XYZ will be the manager, but it's not a company owned and controlled by the residents, then acquiring the freehold would not necessarily, depending on the lease and the agreement between the parties, mean that you could then automatically get rid of the company.
But in general, is it easier than from the leaseholder perspective?
I think there are different scenarios.
different
Like
scenarios.
if you have a two-party lease, so there's the freeholder and each leaseholder, then acquiring the freehold would give you complete control. If you had a three-party lease where there is a freeholder, a residence management company, which you're all shareholders or members of, and then each leaseholder, then that residence management company would still have the obligations and the rights, if you like, to manage the development. But what very often happens is that rather than necessarily forming a separate company, the residence management company is the company that buys the freehold. So two parties out of the three in the lease almost become the same thing. If the management company is what we would refer to as a professional management company, so, well, yeah. so let's say, the lease says freeholder, a company like us, Premier Estates, and each leaseholder, then acquiring the freehold doesn't really change anything. That management company still has all of the same functions.
It would be easier to set up the management, the right to manage things and go down that route.
Potentially it would, yes, because the notices would be served on you.
Yeah.
Except they also have to be served on the other parties who are a party to the lease.
But that particular block.
And the other thing is, as the freeholder, you would, in having the right to collect ground rent, have everybody's details at the development and be able to contact them.
Just another point as well. I didn't mean to ask that question. It just came up. It's a question about the administration charges. Now, in our leases and in the management agreement between the developer and the landlord, there is no mention at all of administration charges. There is mention of management charge, which we accept as 10% of everything they spend, which isn't good, but anyway. Now, the administration charges, we are still being charged for those administration charges, and it's a significant amount of money. But in LBT tribunals and things that we've been through, all as regions, the management company, provide is an overall invoice for the total amount. Now, that amount has been the same to the penny for a few years, which, if it's a legitimate administration thing, there's no way it would be the same.
I think it's probably important to clarify administration charges. They are charges that the freeholder is entitled to charge, not necessarily the management company. So your managing agent might say, okay, I'm charging you whatever to consent for sublet or whatever it might be, and that falls outside this. Administration charges in the context of this are charges that the freeholder of the development levies rather than a managing agent or a management company.
So if your lease, most of you, your leases would say that you can't carry out alterations to your flat. They may say you can't carry them out at all, or they may say you can only carry them out with the landlord's consent. And the landlord will charge you a fee for giving that consent, and that will be an administration charge. Or, much more common, maybe that it says you've got to get consent if you're underletting. and the fee that the landlord pays is an administration fee. You pay the landlord is an administration fee.
We recently challenged our freeholder, who's new, when they decided we were a cash cow, and they could simply smack a charge on us every time we wanted to sublet. And we challenged them with solicitors' letters, and they withdrew that letter. We showed how it wasn't in our lease that they could do that.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.